The camera rolled and evil stepped into frame. Those piercing gray eyes, sharp as winter steel, belonged to the man who made audiences shiver in darkened theaters across the world. Lee Van Cleef, the name alone could silence a saloon. For 2 decades, he was the face of malevolence in Hollywood, the man who could kill you with a glance and make you thank him for it. But on a dusty afternoon in 1967, between takes of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, something happened that would shatter everything the world thought they knew about cinema's most terrifying villain. A small boy, no more than 7 years old, had wandered onto the film set in Spain, lost, crying, speaking only broken Spanish. While crew members scrambled to find his parents, the child did something that froze everyone in place. He ran straight toward the man in black. Lee Van Cleef, still in full costume as Angel Eyes, the merciless killer who had just finished rehearsing a scene where he murdered an entire family, knelt down without hesitation. What happened next would remain hidden from the public for decades. But those who witnessed it never forgot the day the devil himself became someone's guardian angel. The year was 1925 when Clarence Leroy Van Cleef Jr. was born in Somerville, New Jersey. The future face of evil entered this world as the son of an accountant, in a modest home where Sunday dinners mattered more than Sunday gunfights. His mother, Marian, was a gentle woman who filled their house with classical music and homemade cookies. His father, Clarence Sr., taught him that a man's character wasn't measured by the fear he could instill, but by the kindness he could offer when no one was watching. Young Lee was nothing like the cold-blooded killers he would later portray. He was the boy who rescued injured birds, who walked elderly neighbors to church, who spent his allowance on candy for kids who couldn't afford their own. His hands, which would one day be famous for their deadly precision with a Colt .45, were gentle enough to mend a butterfly's broken wing. Those eyes that would later freeze audiences with their menace once wept openly at the local movie theater during Bambi. But destiny has a strange sense of irony. When World War II erupted, the gentle boy from New Jersey found himself aboard a minesweeper in the Pacific, facing real evil for the first time. The war changed him, as it changed every man who lived through hell and somehow found their way back. But unlike so many others, Lee didn't lose his humanity in the darkness. He learned to hide it deeper, to protect it like a secret treasure that was too precious to risk. It was this hidden tenderness that Navy psychiatrists noted in his file, a notation that would later seem impossible to anyone who watched him gun down innocent families in spaghetti westerns. Subject displays unusual empathy, read one report, shows protective instincts toward vulnerable personnel. The same man who would become synonymous with ruthlessness once risked his life to save a drowning sailor who couldn't swim. When Lee returned to New Jersey after the war, he carried 2 things with him: nightmares that would haunt him for years, and an unshakable belief that kindness was the only thing that separated civilized men from animals. It was this belief that led him to community theater, not for fame or money, but because he'd seen enough real violence to last several lifetimes. On stage, violence could be controlled, choreographed, stripped of its true horror. The irony wasn't lost on him when Hollywood came calling. The same face that children had trusted, the same voice that had comforted wounded soldiers, was exactly what casting directors were seeking for villains. His first major role came in 1952's High Noon, where he played one of Frank Miller's gang members. Director Fred Zinnemann later recalled, Lee had this extraordinary ability to look absolutely terrifying on camera. Then, the moment I called cut, he'd ask if anyone needed water or wanted to hear a joke. It was like watching Jekyll and Hyde in reverse. But Hollywood in the 1950s was a machine that fed on typecasting, and Lee Van Cleef's distinctive features, those hawk-like eyes, the angular face that seemed carved from granite, the voice that could make a whisper sound like a threat, made him valuable as one thing: the heavy. For over a decade, he killed his way through B-movies and television westerns, each role cementing his reputation as the man you hired when you needed someone truly scary. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Colleagues spoke of watching Lee prepare for a role, how he could literally change his entire presence. The laugh lines around his eyes would disappear. His shoulders would set differently. Even his breathing would change, becoming slower, more predatory. Method actors talked about becoming their characters. Lee Van Cleef seemed to summon something genuinely dark from within himself. What audiences never knew was that this darkness came from a very real place. His memories of war, of actual evil he had witnessed, of the thin line between civilization and chaos. Yet the moment the cameras stopped rolling, the real Lee would return. Assistant directors learned to factor in extra time for Lee to decompress. After particularly intense scenes, he needed those moments to shed the character's skin, to remember who he actually was underneath the costume and makeup. Sometimes crew members would find him in quiet corners, reading letters from home or looking at photographs of his family. Small rituals that helped him find his way back to himself. The secret that Hollywood never publicized was that Lee Van Cleef was becoming one of the industry's most beloved figures behind the scenes. Stuntmen, who worked with the most dangerous actors in the business, universally praised his professionalism and concern for their safety. During fight scenes, he insisted on multiple rehearsals not to perfect his own performance, but to ensure no one got hurt. Lee was the only actor I knew who would stop in the middle of a take if he thought someone might be at risk. Remembered stunt coordinator Hal Needham, he'd rather reshoot a scene 10 times than have someone get injured because of his character's actions. Stories began to circulate, passed quietly among crew members like cherished secrets. There was the time on the set of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance when a young extra playing a saloon customer nervously spilled beer all over Lee's costume right before a crucial scene. Everyone expected an explosion. The schedule was tight, the producer was already unhappy, and Lee was in full villain mode. Instead, he quietly asked wardrobe to bring the boy a clean shirt, then spent 20 minutes helping him practice his scene so he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Or the incident during the filming of For a Few Dollars More, when a local Italian child actor cast as a street urchin became overwhelmed by the violent scene they were shooting. The boy started crying and couldn't stop. While director Sergio Leone grew frustrated and other actors maintained their stoic professionalism, Lee broke character completely. He sat with the child for an hour, speaking softly in his limited Italian mixed with gentle English, until the boy felt safe enough to continue. These weren't isolated incidents. They were glimpses of a man who understood that his gift for portraying evil came with a responsibility to balance that darkness with equal measures of light. Lee developed an informal mentorship program for young actors struggling with their first villain roles. He understood, better than most, how playing evil could affect someone's psyche. "You have to remember," he once told a young actor, "that the worst thing that could happen isn't that the audience believes you are a bad man. It is that you start believing it yourself." The most remarkable transformation in Lee's career came when Sergio Leone cast him as Angel Eyes in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This wasn't just another villain role. This was evil distilled to its purest essence. Angel Eyes wasn't conflicted or sympathetic. He was death incarnate, a man who killed for pleasure as much as for money. Leone specifically wanted someone who could embody absolute malevolence without a trace of humanity showing through. What Leone didn't know was that he had chosen the one actor in Hollywood who would need to dig deepest into his own capacity for goodness to portray such complete evil. Lee spent weeks preparing for the role, not by studying criminals or psychopaths, but by visiting children's hospitals and volunteer organizations. He needed to fill his soul with enough genuine kindness to survive playing its complete opposite for months on end. The filming in Spain was grueling. The heat was unbearable, the conditions primitive, and the schedule punishing. But it was during this production that Lee Van Cleef's true character shone brightest, precisely because his screen character was so dark. Between takes, while Clint Eastwood and Eli Wallach rested in their trailers, Lee could be found entertaining local children who gathered to watch the filming, teaching them card tricks, and sharing his lunch with families too polite to ask for help. It was during the third week of filming that the incident with the lost boy occurred. The child had wandered away from a nearby village, drawn by the sounds of gunfire and horses. When he stumbled onto the set, dirty and terrified, speaking rapid Spanish through his tears, most people were too busy to notice. But Lee, still wearing Angel Eye's black coat and hat, still carrying the prop Colt .45 that had just killed 3 men in the previous scene, saw the boy immediately. Without thinking, he approached the child, his spurs jangling ominously with each step. The boy looked up at him, this tall, menacing figure dressed like death itself, and instead of running, he reached up with both arms. Lee knelt down, and the boy collapsed against his chest, sobbing. For the next hour, the most feared villain in cinema sat in the Spanish dust, holding a stranger's child, speaking soft words in broken Spanish, while they waited for the boy's frantic parents to arrive. When the parents finally found them, they were prepared to apologize profusely for their son's intrusion. Instead, they found Lee teaching the boy how to braid leather strips, both of them laughing at the child's clumsy attempts. The father later told reporters, "My son said the cowboy in black was the kindest man he had ever met. He didn't know this man was famous for being scary. He only knew he felt safe." This incident became legendary among the film crew, but it was kept secret from the press. Leone, protective of his film's dark reputation, made sure the story didn't leak. But for those who witnessed it, it perfectly captured the enigma of Lee Van Cleef, a man so genuinely good that he could portray evil with unprecedented authenticity, precisely because he understood the true cost of abandoning one's humanity. The success of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly made Lee Van Cleef an international star, but it also intensified the strange double life he was living. Fans around the world feared and admired Angel Eyes, sending him letters that ranged from marriage proposals to death threats. Interviewers wanted to know how he could be so convincingly cruel, never realizing they were asking the wrong question. The real mystery wasn't how Lee could play evil so well. It was how he could remain so fundamentally decent while doing it. His wife, Joan, often spoke of the challenges of being married to cinema's most famous villain. People would cross the street to avoid Lee. Parents would shield their children from him at restaurants, and hotel clerks would refuse to believe he had reservations under his own name. But Joan also saw something the public missed: how these reactions affected her husband, how he internalized the world's fear of him and channeled it into an even deeper commitment to private kindness. At home in Oxnard, California, Lee was simply a neighbor who helped elderly residents with their groceries, who volunteered at the local animal shelter, who coached Little League Baseball, despite having no children of his own on the team. The same hands that had gunned down hundreds of men on screen spent weekends building wheelchair ramps for disabled veterans. The voice that had delivered countless cold-blooded threats was the same one that read bedtime stories to hospitalized children during his frequent, unannounced visits to local medical centers. Perhaps the most telling insight into Lee's character came from his relationship with his own reflection. Makeup artists reported that he never looked at himself in the mirror while in costume. He would close his eyes during the transformation into his villainous characters and wouldn't open them again until he was in front of the cameras. It was as if he needed to preserve some separation between the man he was and the evil he portrayed, to keep some part of himself untouched by the darkness he wore so convincingly. His co-stars noticed this too. Clint Eastwood, who worked with Lee on 3 films, observed, "Lee had this ritual where he would never stay in character between takes. The moment Sergio called cut, Lee would immediately do something kind, ask about someone's family, help with equipment, tell a joke. It was like he was cleansing himself of the role, making sure it didn't stick to him." This dedication to maintaining his humanity while portraying its absence created some of the most memorable moments in film history. His performances were so convincing precisely because they came from a place of truth. Lee Van Cleef understood goodness so completely that he could show its perfect opposite. When Angel Eyes smiled before killing someone, Audiences shivered because they could sense the complete absence of mercy in that expression. What they didn't know was that Lee could portray that absence so perfectly because he possessed mercy in abundance. The years following The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly brought Lee Van Cleef international fame and financial security, but also an unexpected burden. He had become the face of evil for an entire generation, and that reputation followed him everywhere. Children would hide behind their parents when they saw him. Restaurants would fall silent when he entered. Even fellow actors, people who knew him personally, would sometimes seem nervous in his presence off set. But rather than becoming bitter or resentful, Lee seemed to find purpose in this strange fate. He began to see his villainous roles as a form of public service, a way to show audiences what evil looked like, so they could recognize and reject it in real life. He took particular care with his performances, making sure his characters were never sympathetic or appealing. Evil, in his portrayal, was never glamorous or attractive. It was simply evil, something to be feared and opposed. This philosophy led to some of the most uncompromising villain performances in cinema history. Lee's characters didn't have tragic backstories or noble motivations. They were purely antagonistic forces, obstacles to goodness that heroes had to overcome. In interviews, he would explain, "I never try to make my villains likable. The world has enough charming bad guys. What it needs is to remember why good people fight, and they fight because evil is genuinely terrible." The true measure of Lee Van Cleef's character wasn't revealed in his films, but in how he handled his legacy. As Westerns began to fade from popularity in the 1970s, Lee could have easily transitioned to other villain roles or retired on his reputation. Instead, he made a decision that surprised everyone. He began seeking out roles that would allow him to play heroes, or at least complex characters who weren't purely evil. This wasn't vanity or an attempt to change his image. It was Lee's way of completing the circle. He had spent decades showing audiences what evil looked like. Now he wanted to show them what redemption could look like, what it meant for someone to choose goodness despite having the capacity for darkness. His later roles in films like Escape from New York showed characters who were tough and dangerous, but ultimately on the side of right. The transition wasn't always smooth. Directors sometimes struggled to see past his villainous reputation, and audiences occasionally seemed disappointed when he didn't fulfill their expectations for pure evil. But Lee persisted, understanding that his career had given him a unique opportunity to explore the full spectrum of human nature on screen. Behind the scenes, his reputation for kindness had become legendary in Hollywood. Young actors sought him out for advice, not about playing villains, but about maintaining integrity in an industry that often rewarded compromise. Crew members requested to work on his films, knowing that Lee's sets were among the most professional and respectful in the business. Directors valued not just his acting ability, but his leadership qualities and his ability to create positive working environments, even in the most challenging circumstances. One story, told by dozens of different witnesses over the years, perfectly captures the essence of Lee Van Cleef's character. During the filming of his final Western, An Aging Extra, a man who had worked in Hollywood for decades, but never achieved stardom, suffered a mild heart attack during a particularly hot day of shooting. While others called for medical help, Lee immediately went to the man's side. The extra, barely conscious, looked up and saw Lee's face, the same face that had terrified him in darkened theaters for years. But instead of fear, he felt comfort. Lee stayed with him throughout the entire ordeal, riding in the ambulance to the hospital, staying until the man's family arrived. Later, when asked why he had spent his entire day with a stranger, Lee simply said, he was scared and alone. Nobody should have to be scared and alone. The man recovered fully, and until his death years later, he would tell anyone who would listen that the kindest person he had ever met in Hollywood was Lee Van Cleef, the man everyone feared, but who had made him feel safer than he had in years. As Lee aged, his face became even more striking, the lines carved deeper by years and weather. Ironically, This made him even more effective in his villainous roles. But it also revealed something else. A gentleness around his eyes that cameras couldn't quite capture but people could sense in person. Those who met him late in his career often described the same phenomenon, expecting to feel intimidated. They instead felt immediately at ease, as if his presence was somehow comforting rather than threatening. This contradiction, the man who looked like danger but felt like safety, became Lee Van Cleef's greatest legacy. He had spent his career proving that appearances could be deceiving, that the capacity for evil and the choice of goodness could coexist in the same person. His villains were terrifying because audiences sensed they were watching someone who truly understood both darkness and light, who had chosen which side to serve in his real life, even as he portrayed its opposite on screen. When Lee Van Cleef passed away in 1989, the tributes that poured in revealed the full scope of his hidden kindness. Children he had mentored, now adults with careers of their own, spoke of his encouragement and support. Fellow actors shared stories of his generosity and professionalism. Crew members talked about his leadership and care for their safety. Medical workers remembered his frequent visits to hospitals, always unannounced, never seeking publicity. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from an unexpected source. The child who had run to him on that dusty Spanish film set over 20 years earlier. Now a grown man with children of his own, he had traveled from Spain to attend Lee's funeral. Through tears, he told reporters, the whole world knew him as a dangerous man, a killer, someone to fear. But he was the first person I ever trusted completely. When I was lost and scared, he found me and made me safe. That is who he really was. Not the man who pretended to be dangerous, but the man who made danger go away. In the end, Lee Van Cleef's greatest performance wasn't any of his villainous roles. It was the daily performance of being a good man in a world that wanted to see him as evil, of choosing kindness when cruelty would have been easier, of using his gift for portraying darkness to make the world a little brighter. The angel behind the devil's eyes had spent his entire career hiding in plain sight, teaching audiences about evil by showing them what it meant to reject it, even when everyone expected you to embrace it. The camera had stopped rolling long ago, but the real Lee Van Cleef, the man who knelt in Spanish dust to comfort a stranger's child, who built wheelchair ramps on weekends, who never let the world's fear change his fundamental nature, that performance continued until his final breath. And in a world that often struggles to distinguish between the roles we play and the people we choose to be, his life remains a quiet testament to the power of choosing goodness, even when it is easier to be the villain everyone expects you to be.